scope of the flood is another point of controversy. Was it local or global? None of the Mesopotamian accounts even hint at a worldwide flood. All are placed within the Euphrates basin.
Artists' impressions show the influence of the global flood model, a monstrous ship set upon the high seas, battered by waves.
By contrast, this cylinder seal impression was recovered from Uruk, biblical Erech, and dated by archaeologists to the 3rd millennium BC. By his relative size and dress, we can tell the man in the middle of the boat is a king. He is not a Sumerian, although the boatmen on either side obviously are. Now, what would a Mesopotamian king be doing on a boat loaded with crates and animals?
Then why are there so many people who think the flood enveloped the entire globe?
Part of it is tradition, a misunderstanding that has endured for centuries. Part of it is that the translation from Hebrew into English was performed by translators who labored within the same tradition, choosing their English equivalents to reflect a global flood. And part of it is due to the requirement by creationists that the entire world must be on the order of 6,000 years of age or so, and a worldwide flood is necessary to sequence the fossil record. Otherwise, the fossil record would be laid down in time, a result of hundreds of millions of years of deposition all over the world, and they don't allow any time. So, for a variety of reasons, the notion of a worldwide flood persists despite a mountain of evidence to the contrary.
Also, animals died in the flood. It would be well nigh impossible for animals from all over the world to make their way to the ark and then find their way back to where they came from after the voyage.
Writing in 1954, Bernard Ramm wrote, "The flood was local to the Mesopotamian valley. The animals that came, prompted by divine instinct, were the animals of that region. They were preserved for the good of man after the flood. Man was destroyed within the boundaries of the flood. The record is mute about man in America or Africa or China."
We have heard that flood stories are common throughout the world, and that suggests a worldwide flood. So what about the flood stories that permeate the mythology of remote populations?
What we find is that the differences more than offset the similarities. The Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible deflates the idea that flood stories from different parts of the world might be related to the biblical account. At one time, this widespread distribution of a flood tradition was considered proof of the historicity of the biblical account, which with some expected modification had spread throughout the world as people migrated from their original homeland in the Near East. This notion has necessarily been given up. We know, for example, that numerous peoples have no flood legends in their literature. Flood stories are almost entirely lacking in Africa, occur only occasionally in Europe, and are absent in many parts of Asia. They are widespread in America, Australia, and the islands of the Pacific. In addition, many of the known flood legends differ radically from the biblical story and stand independently of it and of one another. Many do not know a worldwide flood at all, but only a local inundation. Often the heroes saved themselves in boats or by scaling mountains without intervention by the gods. Furthermore, only a few of the flood stories give the wickedness of man as the cause for the flood. The duration of the flood, if given, varies from a few days to many years. Facts of this kind disprove the claim that the biblical account is the parent of all flood stories. And further, there is one flood tradition which bears such striking resemblance to the biblical story that it must be directly related to it. That is the cuneiform Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian tradition.
Also, early missionaries had an impact on the mythology of primitive peoples. The biblical account of the Great Flood, related by missionaries, would become interwoven with ancient tribal stories to produce hybrid myths that would mimic Genesis.
Theodore Gaster authored the book Myth, Legend, and Custom in the Old Testament. He wrote, "No flood story can be traced in Sanskrit until after elements of the Aryan civilization began to arrive in India. The Nestorian Christian missionary attempts in China stand out as the source of the flood story amongst the Lolos people."
According to Gleason Archer, who wrote a survey of Old Testament introduction, the list of descendants in the respective lines of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, as recorded in Genesis 10, does not permit an easy identification with the remoter races who lived in the lower reaches of Africa, Far East Asia, Australia, and the Americas, particularly in the case of Australia, with its peculiar fauna indicating a long period of separation from the Eurasian continent. The difficulty of assigning either the humans or the subhuman population with the passengers in the ark has been felt to be acute.
In other words, the Bible is silent on any possible relationship between the descendants of Noah and the Asian race or Native Americans who descended from the Asians, or black Africans, or the Aborigines who populated Australia, or blonde-haired Scandinavians, not to exclude any racial group. That squares exactly with what we know about the antiquity of those races of peoples who were far distant from the Mesopotamian plain at 5,000 years ago. In our next episode, we will look at the date of the flood and examine the places where the ark could have landed, both the probable and the improbable. Don't hesitate to email me if there are any questions over the material we have covered. It's a lot to take in. Just keep in mind there are 3 ways to view the material in Genesis 2 through 11. Some believe it is true human history. Some say it is made up human history. Or it could be authentic Semitic history, the history of the covenant race, not the human race. The sheer weight of an abundance of evidence falls on that answer. Thank you for spending time with us, and thanks to Ken Miller, my co-host.